This is Module 16, Basic Concepts of Sensation and Perception. There's a lot of material in this chapter that you don't have to know, so make sure you follow the study guide and just study the sections that are necessary from this chapter. Let's start by having you read this. You can pause it if you want to finish reading it, but I'm not going to wait the whole time because I don't know how long it's taking you to finish reading it. Anyway, what's interesting is that a lot of people can read this pretty smooth. It's not nearly as difficult as a person might think, and some of the things we're going to be talking about in this module are reasons why that occurs. Our brain processes information in a couple different ways. One is called bottom-up processing, which would be anytime we're analyzing the core features of information, like sounding out words letter by letter, for example, would be an example of bottom-up processing. But we also process a lot of information in a top-down manner, which means you have expectations from past experiences that guide your processing of information. So what kind of process was working when you read the paragraph on the previous slide? Think about it. That's right, top-down processing. You have a lot of experience reading words and a lot of information stored about how words look, and we tend to read those words correctly because, well, the features of those words, meaning the individual letters, are similar enough, close enough to what we have stored in memory from our past experiences that we're able to read those pretty easily. So let's make the distinction here between sensation and perception. Sensation has to do more with the information as it reaches our sensory organs, and our sensory organs then translate that information from the special neurons in each sensory organ. They're stimulated by that information, whether it's light waves or sound waves or whatever, and they send chemical messages to the cortex. That's the sensation. The perception is where those sensations are given meaning, which generally occurs in the cortex, where our brain is able to kind of collate and organize all the information coming from our sensory organs to make sense of that. So for example, if there are smoke molecules floating in the air, they would stimulate the special neurons called receptor cells in your nasal cavity, and they would become stimulated and send messages to your brain. That's the sensation. The perception is where you perceive that as the smell of smoke, as opposed to some other smell like perfume or something. So it's where the sensations have meaning that occurs in the cortex, and that's what we call perception. So remember that every sensory organ has these sensory receptor cells. They're special neurons that detect stimuli from the environment. So on the retina of your eye are these special neurons, these sensory receptor cells that are stimulated by light waves. And when they're stimulated, they send chemical messages to your brain. And the only thing that will stimulate those receptor cells in your eye are light waves. Sound waves won't do it. Microwaves won't do it. Radio waves won't do it. Temperature won't do it. Only light waves. And all of the neurons in each of our sensory organs are highly specialized to process that very special type of information. So for example, those in your deep inside your ear that process auditory information, the only thing that stimulates them are sound waves. You could snake one of those tiny little flexible flashlights that they use sometime for surgery with like cameras with little lights on the end of them. You could snake one of those down inside your ear and turn the light on, and you wouldn't see that light because the receptor cells in your ear only respond to sound waves. And when I mentioned, of course, that when these neurons or receptor cells are stimulated, they send chemical messages to the brain. That's called transduction. Those neural impulses reach the brain, and then we can interpret those sensations as sounds and sights and odors and all kinds of stuff. So every receptor cell, there's a certain threshold that has to be reached in order for that cell to be stimulated enough to send messages to the brain, and that's called the absolute threshold. So that's the smallest amount of stimulus that can be detected 50% of the time. So for example, for vision, on a clear night you can see a candle flame from 30 miles away. There's just enough light waves reaching your retina from that far away that it's enough to stimulate the neurons or receptor cells on your retina. Anything further than that is also giving off light, but probably not enough light waves to stimulate those receptor cells. So sometimes there are stimuli that's present, but there's just not quite enough of it to stimulate those receptor cells. And we would say that those fall in the subliminal range. So even though they're there, you don't perceive them because there's not enough of it there to cause transduction to occur. One of the questions that comes up often is, can we be influenced by subliminal information? And it's to some degree yes. So what we find is that subliminal information kind of can prime you to think certain ways, perhaps. So this is called the priming effect. And an example of that might be if an instructor was teaching a course and just kind of nonchalantly throughout an hour lecture mentions something about a student being sharp as a fox, or and then when somebody answers a question later, he says something like, "Oh, you answered that quicker than a fox," and students might not even notice or remember that he said the word fox a couple times. And at the end of the class period, he might ask students to come up with the first animal they can think of, and you might notice that fox comes up more frequently than any other animal, and that would be due to the priming effect. But when it comes to subliminal information being used to persuade people to buy products or something, there is no evidence that has any effect on our purchasing behavior. So to see how the priming effect works, though, this is a little online demonstration. Imagine that you're one subject who's in this condition. You're shown 5 pictures and then an ambiguous photo, and you have to see how quickly you can guess what the last image is. And you have to guess what this is. You have to tell the experimenter when you know what it is, so they know what step you were at when you solved this. Alright, perhaps you know what that is, perhaps you don't. But other subjects would be given this condition with these pictures. and then the same final part. Got it? Yep. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Point is that by being shown animals, it kind of subconsciously or unconsciously primes people to be able to solve this easier. It's a horse with a guy riding the horse, a man or a woman riding on the back of the horse. So being shown pictures of animals kind of primes you to recognize that more quickly. So a little bit ago we mentioned the sensory receptor cells, which are the special neurons in our sensory organs that respond to stimuli in the environment. And the sensory receptor cells can fire up to 200 times a second, but if the amount of stimulation is steady over a long period of time, the firing rate begins to slow down. As a result, the intensity of that stimulus seems to lessen to us. Our perception is that there's less of it because the firing rate has slowed down on those receptor cells and we're not getting as many chemical messages. And that's called sensory adaptation. And all of our sensory organs are subject to experience this phenomenon. So for example, you might have noticed a time where you walked into a residence and the home of people who smoke, perhaps, and you notice the smoke right away. It's very noticeable to you because your nasal cavity is being bombarded with those odor molecules. But after you've been in there for 10 minutes or so, if the amount of smoke in the room is relatively stable, the firing rate of those sensory receptor cells will slow down, and you might notice after you've been in there 10 or 15 minutes that you don't really notice the smell of the smoke very much. That's sensory adaptation. Likewise, when you jump into a swimming pool and there's a big change in temperature between the air temperature and the water, it might seem like the water is super cold, but after you've been in there for 10 or 15 minutes and the firing rate of the neurons in your skin slow down, the water doesn't ever seem nearly as cold. And we can experience that with taste and even hearing too, where sometimes you go to a concert and music seems really loud at first, but after 15 or 20 minutes the music doesn't seem quite as loud. One sensory organ that we don't experience that a lot with on a regular basis is vision, because the sensory receptor cells are so tightly packed on the retina, the area of the retina where we look directly at things for detail and color vision, that even the slightest movement of your eye will stimulate more neurons. So there's always new neurons being stimulated on the retina, so we don't really experience much sensory adaptation. You can experience it though in your peripheral vision, where the receptor cells are not quite as densely packed. And so this slide here would demonstrate that. If you stare at the dot, the red dot in the middle, and can keep your eyes real still, you'll notice that the green circle in your peripheral vision will disappear. And as soon as you move your eyes, the image will shift on your retina and stimulate different neurons. But if you keep your eyes real still, it can get the entire thing to disappear, which is pretty cool.